We live in uncertain times. We all know this. We live that uncertainty every day. If we forget for even a moment how uncertain things are, we have only to turn to the news to be reminded of all that is happening. Global conflicts, political turmoil, the questioning of democracy, the changes of the climate, the continuing pandemic. I could go on and on. The thing is, as bad as it can seem right now, in another sense, nothing has changed. The world I grew up in was uncertain too. I'm sure that was true of all of us. Some of us lived through World War II when the whole world went to war in an attempt to stop global fascism. Others of us came of age during the Cold War and grew up in the shadow of the nuclear bomb. I know I did. I don't remember actually having to do those duck and cover drills at school where children practice crouching under their desk in what seems, in retrospect, an absolutely absurd attempt to protect them from a nuclear blast. But I do remember people talking about building bomb shelters in their homes. In fact, I myself got caught up on this. I was 7 at the time and very worried about the threat of nuclear war. I remember looking through my parents' copies of Newsweek and finding there a chart comparing the size of Russian missiles with those of the US. Russia's were so much larger that it scared me. It was meant to. I began to have trouble sleeping at night and would suddenly freeze whenever I was out playing and suddenly I heard the sound of an airplane overhead. I was terrified that it was a Russian bomber. At the time, my parents were buying a new house. It was the first house we actually owned. Before then, we had always rented. And what delighted me most about that, though, was that the new house had a basement. That's because I grew up in Southern California where homes with basements were very rare. None of my friends had homes with basements, but now suddenly we did. And I immediately knew what we had to do with that basement. I went to my dad at once and suggested that we use it for a bomb shelter. He dismissed the idea immediately, but I didn't give up. I began to build a rickety shelf intended to hold tin cans that we could to store there. The thing is, I've never been known as much of a carpenter. And as a matter of fact, I have only to take out a hammer and nails start flying out of walls. And anything made of wood just starts collapsing in front of me. And I was 7 years old. I did manage to get the shelf to the point where it could stand as long as nothing was actually put on it, or as long as nobody touched it. So I considered that a success. But when I began to make a bed for myself out of plywood so that I could sleep in the basement, it collapsed the first time I lay down on it. So I ended up having to give up on the bomb shelter and just try to live with my anxiety. This turned out to be good practice because the uncertainty of those times has never really gone away. Jesus lived in uncertain times too. The Israelites were a fiercely independent people after all. They were chafing under Roman domination. Everyone knew that a rebellion was coming. Even so, Jesus surprised his disciples when he predicted that the great temple of Jerusalem would soon be destroyed. It had just been rebuilt, and it was a marvel of the age. It was a thing of beauty. It was made to last with massive stone upon massive stone. It must have seemed unbelievable to the disciples that this would just disappear. And yet, by the time Luke sat down to write his gospel some 50 years later, it was already gone. All that remained was a single wall, the Wailing Wall, that can be seen in Jerusalem to this day. The thing is, Jesus predicted that this catastrophe was only the beginning. The times were uncertain, he said, and they would get worse, much worse. It was the beginning of the end. And so it has remained until today. We live constantly in uncertain times. We never stop wondering if this is it. We never stop wondering if the end has finally come. You know, all this seems pretty grim, doesn't it? I mean, that's the first thing I thought of when I read this reading. I thought, where's the good news? Isn't that what Jesus brought us? Good news? But where's the good news in today's reading? It's there. The fact is, it is there, but it's buried, which is too bad because it truly is good news. It's the good news we need the most. That is, it's the good news we need for uncertain times. Times like Jesus's time. Times like the Cold War. Times like now. The good news is there in today's gospel, but it's easy to miss in all the dire predictions. So let's pull it out. Even as Jesus is telling us of all the scary things that are going to occur, he also says this: do not be terrified. Not a hair on your head will perish. And by your endurance, you will gain your souls. Do not be terrified. By your endurance, you will gain your souls. By your endurance, you will gain your souls. So what's Jesus saying here? I think it's this. I think he's saying, yes, we live in uncertain times, and most of us hate uncertainty. There's so little we can count on, so few things we can say for sure. In fact, the only things that we can say with absolute certainty is first, that things will always change, and second, that we will die. If we're Christian, though, we can also add one thing more. We also know that God is with us for all time. And that's critical. For as long as we cling to that truth, we'll get through. As long as we hold on to this knowledge of who God is for us, we'll be able to let go of fear and endure. And by our endurance, we'll gain our souls. That's because God is eternal. And what we call our soul is a door to God. We need only open that door and walk through to see that God is part of us and we are part of God. So we are eternal too. We need to cling to that. You know, there's a poem that talks about this very thing. It's a poem I love. Its title is The Way It Is. And it's by one of my favorite poets. His name is William Stafford. Stafford lived from 1914 to 1993, making a home in Lake Oswego, Oregon, where he taught and wrote every day. He left a huge body of poems. In fact, when he died, he left boxes with 22,000 poems. The Way It Is probably his most famous. It goes like this. There's a thread you follow. It goes among things that change, but it doesn't change. People wonder about what you're pursuing. You have to explain about the thread, but it's hard for others to see. While you hold it, you can't get lost. Tragedies happen. People get hurt or die, and you suffer and get old. Nothing you do can stop time's unfolding. You don't ever let go of the thread. That's it. That's the whole poem. The thing is, because poems are hard to absorb, let me read it again. There's a thread you follow. It goes among things that change, but it doesn't change. People wonder about what you're pursuing. You have to explain about the thread, but it's hard for others to see. While you hold it, you can't get lost. Tragedies happen, people get hurt or die, and you suffer and get old. Nothing you do can stop time's unfolding. You don't ever let go of the thread. You see, that's exactly what Jesus is saying in today's gospel. He's saying that times can get hard. He's saying that bad things can happen. He's saying that we will suffer and grow old. He's saying that things may grow very difficult at times, but as long as we hold on to one thing, one thread, we will be okay. We will endure. And what is that one thread? It is our link to God. And as long as we cling to that, we gain our souls. In fact, that thread is our soul. And yet this thread is hard for others to see. There are many who just don't get it. But that shouldn't stop us. We just have to hold tight and not let go. And maybe in time, those others will find their thread too. Let's hope so. Because we live in uncertain times and we all need something to get us through. We all need God. That's why it's so important. You don't ever let go of the thread. Amen.